Welcome to the Monday, September 22nd, Washougal City Council Workshop meeting. Rose, could you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Boger. Councilmember Wagner.
Here.
Councilmember McDaniel.
Here.
Councilmember Greenlee.
Here.
Councilmember Shoemaker.
Here.
Councilmember Lindsay.
Here.
Councilmember Freeman.
Here.
Thank you. Councilmember Boger did let us know that he could not be here for the workshop this evening. Are there any members of the public that would like to address council? Okay. Moving along, new business. Public Works. Trevor, you've got a couple of items for us.
Yes. First, we have a presentation from Paul Lewis, who's been assisting us on financing options in regards to the wastewater treatment plant expansion, the bids that were opened a few weeks ago. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Trevor. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been working with staff along with Jim Nelson from D.A. Davidson on a project to assess the different options you have available for you in terms of financing the wastewater treatment plant improvements. And in terms of the presentation, just want to hit on a couple things. First, set up the background and objectives for the analysis, hit you up front with the summary recommendation, and then walk you through how we came to that, including touching on the funding scenarios that we looked at and the analysis of those scenarios and alternatives, and then close with some discussion and also frame what the next steps would be. Okay? Any questions about what we're going to try and cover? As you're aware, the wastewater treatment improvements were bid in August. The low bid came in at $12.1 million, which was below the engineer's estimate of $12.6 million. So it's about $500,000 below the engineer's estimate. The funding for the improvements was originally contemplated to come from revenue bonds to be issued in 2014. Actually, 2011 bonds were going to pay for part of this, along with the new bonds, new revenue bonds, to be issued in 2014. And the debt service on those bonds was factored into your rates, the sewer rates, included in the study that SCS did for you and your sewer rates. So again, the original rate study, the current rates, contemplated the debt service for financing these improvements. The objectives of the analysis we did was to assess the costs, benefits, and the risks associated with the financing options that could potentially be available to you to fund the treatment plant improvements. We developed 4 scenarios involving the accepting the bid now and financing, going forward with financing now, and 3 scenarios that involved rejecting the bid and waiting to hear regarding the state loans. I think you're aware you're contemplating applying for Public Works Trust Fund loans, a loan, and then also a state revolving fund loan. And there's some question about both the timing and the certainty of those 2 loan applications, and we'll get into that in a minute. We wanted to model those 2 scenarios. Okay. Regarding the timing of that, just to frame that a little bit more, we would expect to hear on those loan applications probably in the first quarter, but you wouldn't necessarily have certainty in terms of the funding until after the legislative session, because both of them require legislative approval before there's certainty applied to those funding loans. Okay? One other caveat before I get into the analysis. I'm going to show you some numbers in here. I don't want you to take away that these are the exact numbers that you would get when you're going to go forward in financing. These are scenarios. They're constructed with assumptions. I'll try and be clear on what those assumptions are, but the scenarios are described. Your actual costs will be dependent upon the timing of when you act and the interest rate environment in the marketplace when you go to the marketplace, and then also to the extent that you have any additional costs or savings compared to the numbers that I show you here today. Okay? So just a little bit of a caveat in terms of what we're going to go through. With that said, the summary recommendation is to, this is coming from the staff, this is to award the bid for the $12.1 million. Again, the costs are 4% below the engineer's estimate. The financing would proceed in the near term you'd issue between $4 and $5 million in bank-qualified revenue bonds. And bank-qualified are essentially small issuer bonds. If you're issuing less than $10 million in a year, there's a preferential interest rate. It relates to the tax treatment that banks, who are usually the purchasers of these small issue revenue bond, tax-exempt bond debts, they're given a little bit extra preferential treatment. And there has been high demand for these bonds as well in the marketplace. And so the current interest rate environment for that is in the 3 to 3.26 range. These quotes come from D.A. Davidson. That's compared to in excess of 4 to 4.25% for a traditional 20-year bond. Okay. Moving forward with financing now, we believe will preserve the lowest interest rate option in 2015. It also provides somewhat of a hedge for the state loan options, allows you to proceed with financing, but also preserves the opportunity to take advantage of the low interest rate loans if you're awarded those loans.
Do you want questions now, or?
I'm happy with questions now.
Yeah. So are you going to tell us why you believe we would have the lowest interest rate in 2015?
Yes.
Okay.
The short answer is it splits up your bond issue into two pieces that are both below 10 million. So it lets you take advantage of that bank qualified interest rate. And that's between 0.3 and 0.4% lower than what you would get in the marketplace.
Okay.
Okay? And it also allows you to capture the savings now in comparison to the FCS rate model assumptions. The rate model assumed an interest rate of 4.5% on the debt that was going to be issued for the wastewater treatment plant improvements. Okay? So that's the summary recommendation, and I'll walk you through how we got there. So first up are just a description of the funding scenarios, and there's as I mentioned, there's 7 of them, but they were a set of common assumptions that we used in all 7. The first is that we would have $1 million available from the sewer utility operating and capital reserves, and that excludes the amount that needs to be set aside per the bond covenants. There's some bond covenant requirements for a debt service coverage ratio. I'll get into the exact dollar amounts there in a minute. And it also excludes commitments of reserves for other projects that are in the pipeline. Another common assumption is that there would be $3 million from the 2011 bond issue that would be used to pay for the wastewater treatment plant improvements. The exception to that is the scenarios involving the state revolving fund loan. One of those requires no money from the 2011 bond, and one of those requires about $800,000 from that revenue bond. And then we've also included, in addition to the costs provided by staff, the $12.1 million plus the additional costs to complete the project, we've added a $1 million contingency to all of the scenarios. And that works out to 7.1% of the $14.1 million estimated project cost. Okay? A little more on the reserve management constraints. I think this was a question that came up in a prior workshop, but the bond covenants require reserves, annual operating cash flow of 1.25 times annual debt service. Your debt service on the revenue bonds is about 1.5 million. That requires about $375,000 of coverage, is what they call it, that 0.25 times. In addition, you have a minimum of 60 days of operating expenses that you're required to keep in reserves. Again, the bond buyers and the rating agencies like to see that as and your insurers like to see that as a cushion in terms of keeping that operating expense cushion in place. The FCS rate model also factors in using the operating surpluses to fund future capital projects, as I mentioned before. I believe there was a transfer that was anticipated in the rate model in 2013 and 2014 that will be made in 2014. And to put some numbers to that explanation, these came from Jennifer. The operating fund balance is currently estimated at roughly $4.6 million. The bond covenants require set aside in reserves of 2.5, leaving roughly $2.1 million available for capital projects. The treatment plant project in our scenarios are assumed to take 1 million of that and 1.1 million being left available for other projects. Okay? So these are all setups, including the description of the scenarios, setups for the analysis. So again, as I mentioned, there were 7 scenarios that we looked at. The first 4 involve accepting the bid. The first scenario is to proceed with issuing revenue bonds. And this is, again, as I mentioned, sort of a 2-series revenue bond issue, keeping both under $10 million to achieve the lowest interest rate on the revenue bonds. Again, the current quotes we're getting 3.06. Today's number is 3.26, sort of a high rate quote from D.A. Davidson. And again, 1 bond issue in 2014, and then a second in 2015, keeping both of those under the $10 million limit. Scenario 2 would be a revenue bond combined with a Public Works Trust Fund loan. So you'd go ahead and issue the $4 to $5 million of revenue bonds in 2014, and then if you're awarded a Public Works Trust Fund loan, you're applying for $7 million, that would come in the second quarter of 2015. That carries an interest rate of 2.55%, which is obviously lower than the 3.06, but and lower than the 3.26 that we used actually in the scenarios. I should clarify that. Scenario 1, we used the higher rate number for the numbers that I'll show you later. So that scenario 2 would be a combination of revenue bond financing as well as Public Works Trust Fund loan. And then again, embedded in all of these is $3 million from the 2011 bond issue. Third scenario assumes that you're successful with your state revolving fund loan at $14.1 million. And really this scenario could be any combination of the state revolving fund and Public Works Trust Fund. The state revolving fund has an interest rate of 2.4%, slightly better than the 2.55 from the Public Works Trust Fund loan, but really not much of a difference in terms of this type of analysis. That would include some short-term financing. So if you were to wait and go out with just the 14.1 million, you'd have the 1% interest rate on any kind of short-term bridge loan. And there would be no need to use the 2011 bond proceeds as in the other scenarios. The fourth scenario involves issuing a revenue bond. So if you were to wait and see if you were able to be awarded a state revolving fund loan and you were denied that loan, then you would be in the position of having to issue $12.4 million of revenue bond debt in the second or third quarter, most likely the third quarter of 2015. Since that's over that $10 million limit, you wouldn't benefit from the lowest rate available. That rate would be roughly 0.3% higher than what we're assuming in the other scenarios for the bank qualified loan. And then in addition, we're assuming an interest rate environment, an increasing interest rate environment. So if you were to wait 9 to 12 months to issue that revenue bond, we're assuming to be conservative that the interest rate would be roughly 0.5% higher. So instead of a 3.26% cost of borrowing, you'd be in the 4.06% is what we're modeling here. Okay? So that's the scenario 4. That's the 4 scenarios that involve accepting the bid. As I mentioned, there are 3 scenarios that involve rejecting the bid. Scenario 5 assumes that you're successful in your state revolving fund loan application, but you've delayed. Since you've rejected the bid, you're looking at a potential cost increase from that scenario. And the assumption that we used here was a 5% increase in costs when you rebid. The project would start in the third quarter of 2015, so there'd be somewhat of a delay as well in terms of bringing that project online. Scenario 6 is a revenue bond if you're unsuccessful with the state revolving fund loan. Again, same scenario, project costs increase by 5% at rebid. It's really similar to scenario 4, except you're stuck doing a revenue bond in the third quarter of 2015. And then scenario 7, which is the same as scenario 6, with the exception of a 10% cost increase superimposed instead of a 5% cost increase. So those are the scenarios. Before I get to the results, are there any questions in terms of those scenarios, things that you had thought about that we haven't really covered, or questions about the assumptions?
The $3 million from the 2011 bond, those bonds have been issued and sold?
Correct. So you've received those proceeds in late 2011, I believe. And so those have been being used for other projects, but there's still some money on hand available to be used for future projects. And they were initially earmarked for this project. So.
Thank you.
Okay?
Michelle?
So scenario 1, does that necessarily turn into scenario 2 then if you get the PWTF?
Correct.
That would, okay.
And that's really very good point. That's really the crux of the recommendation, is that you're able to preserve the flexibility and hedge against the risks. So by going forward now with the bond issue in 2014, that money, if you don't need it for the for the wastewater treatment plant, we believe you have the ability to use that for the other series of, you've got a 6-year capital program in the rate model. I'm sure you're going to be updating your general sewer plan coming up. There will be projects for that money to be used on.
If we accept this particular bid, what's the payment structure? When do they, how much and when?
Typically, the first costs incurred are the mobilization. There's a cap, a threshold inside the proposed contract of no more than, I believe, 5%. But typically it's mobilization, and it's really season dependent when they actually start doing the excavation. So starting potentially mid-fall, early winter, it may be strung out a little bit further as far as being able to do some of that concrete and flat work and rebar work. So it's really season dependent, and then mobilization depending on where the contractor is coming from. The apparent low right now is out of Salem, just east of Salem State, and so it wouldn't be that huge of a mobilization, I would anticipate, depending on what type of projects they have in the Northwest.
And in preparation for doing this analysis, we had the city engineer craft a quarterly cash flow estimate for the project. And so Paul was informed by the quarterly cash flow estimate, and our consulting engineer helped with that as well. So there's quarterly dollar amounts for every quarter, beginning with the fourth quarter of 14, every quarter in 15, and 1 or 2 quarters in 16 till project completion. So that cash flow need is embedded within the analysis, and each of the recommendations ensures that we can meet contractual obligations for cash flow. I think that's what you were getting at.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
Well,
Bank qualified bonds, the typical tax exempt 20-year bond is you can't pay it off early. How about the bank qualified?
Same structure
Okay.
that's typically used. In terms of can't pay it off early, oftentimes you see sort of graduated maturities. So you'll have bonds that are maturing sometimes beginning in year 10, sometimes earlier, but your annual debt service is scheduled, so you pay that bond, the principal amounts plus the interest over time. So a lot of times you'll see that those bonds have maturities as early as 5 years or all the way up to 20 years. But that's different than having a callable bond, at your will. Those are really structured maturities that you have to
Right.
pay off.
Right.
So there's a distinction between a callable bond and a bond that includes maturities at an earlier date than the 20-year time frame.
So these are typically not callable bonds.
Typically not. Oftentimes you'll see a 10-year call provision in some. Less frequently, fairly rare, I guess, would be a 5-year call, and anything below that, I think, is not,
Right,
especially when you're trying to get a longer-term
right.
structure. So, okay? So one other framing for the scenarios is to just reiterate some of the risks that we have talked about. One is interest rate risk. there are two pieces to this. One is the bank qualified versus not bank qualified, and that $10 million threshold. So what we're trying to do is to get you the lowest interest rate is to split your bond issue up into two pieces that are less than the $10 million. The second is rising interest rate environment, and I think most of the experts have anticipated that interest rates would be increasing before now, and most are still keeping to that mantra where future rates are going to be higher than current rates. And I'll show you a chart on the next page that talks about at least the 20-year municipal bond market. Construction cost risk. I think there's some uncertainty regarding future costs. Your cost right now, your bid is below the engineer's estimate. The environment seems to be heating up, although with the the state funding for infrastructure being somewhat questionable. I don't know what the marketplace is going to be like in 6 months or so in terms of rebidding. I think that given the heating up of the economy, there's a lot more private construction going on now, but there may be a little bit less public construction, especially without a transportation package and those types of things. So I think there's always risk of not going forward when you have a bid that's below your engineer's estimate. The last is the state loan application risk. You put your application in, it'll get ranked. You'll be made aware of where you are in that ranking, but there's obviously lots of pressure at the state level in terms of the funding that could be available for both the Public Works Trust Fund program as well as the state revolving fund. The revolving fund is typically federal money. It is federal money that flows through to the state, but again, where you rank and how much money they have available, those are all variables that you'll be subject to with your state loan application.
I could just comment, Paul, briefly. We already have had our application for the Public Works Trust Fund reviewed. It's accepted, and we're on the Public Works Board's recommended list. I think I mentioned this at the last work session. We're kind of in the middle of the list. The total amount of loans recommended by the board is equivalent to the revenue that they'll receive over the biennium from interest payments on existing loans, about $185 million. The idea behind that is to advocate to the legislature that that's self-sustaining, if you would, and that the revenue going to the state from the interest payments on existing Public Works Trust Fund loans could be used to source loans moving forward in that important program. However, there's no obligation on the legislature's part to do that, and as we saw last time, and as you can imagine this time, those revenues are at risk. They're at great risk to be swept in the legislature's General Fund Balancing Act as they deal with the education mandate and other pressures. On the revolving fund side, that application is due later in the year. We feel pretty confident in that application, and that has informed Paul's analysis, that confidence, just because of our conversations with the staff, and they worked with us the last cycle. But until you have it, you don't have it. So there's some risk that neither of those could pan out for us.
Although those are dedicated funds.
Those are dedicated funds. Can't be swept.
If you took the $185 million and all the projects ahead of us, would we get funded?
Yes, we're in the middle of the $185 million list.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
I thought we were in the middle of the list.
Kind of middle third, sort
Okay.
of middle third. We might be just below the 50% mark, but
All right.
yeah, we did really well. It's the quality of the project and the team that put together the application.
Michelle?
What's the difference between scenario 1 and scenario 3? Do you have a general idea of how much savings could possibly be had?
Yes, in fact, we'll get to that
Okay.
in a couple of slides
All
and
right.
compare the
Okay.
numbers. Okay? This is just a chart that Jim provided, Jim Nelson, shows you the municipal bond market rates going back to 2008. You can see the increasing rate environment from a year or so ago. Rates have since come down and really are close to their all-time lows of early in 2012. Okay?
Did you say it starts at 2008?
Yes, August. Yeah.
Let me get my binoculars.
Yeah, I know it's a little bit small, but, okay? Yeah, August.
So you said the September number is down below 4? No,
The bank qualified is 3.06 to 3.26. The current quote that I got was 4.14. So we're in the, it's come down a little bit from this August 28th to the September 14th number. Okay? So, to show you the results of the alternatives analysis, I've got a series of slides that compare the total debt financed, the annual interest rate, and then the net present value of the total interest costs over the life of the financing. So this first one just shows you the total debt that you incur to finance the project under the different scenarios. The accept scenarios are in blue, the reject scenarios are in red, and you can see the first two, to no surprise, involve the state revolving fund loan. Not only do you borrow less, but the interest rate is lower, which you'll see in the next slide. But those two are the best financial outcomes in terms of the debt that you would incur. Following that are the three other accept now options. The first one being option 2 with a revenue bond and the Public Works Trust Fund loan. So essentially taking advantage of that $7 million of 2.55% money and combining it with a revenue bond of the 3.26%. And then option 1 is all revenue bond financing. And then option 4, which is assuming that you are denied, you essentially wait, and you're denied on your loan applications, and you're faced with issuing a revenue bond in 2015, later in 2015. Okay? And then followed by the 2 reject, all revenue bond delayed with a 5% cost increase, and then all revenue bond delayed with a 10% cost increase. So you can see roughly a $4.5 million spread, a little bit over 30%. Just to point out a couple things, the spread between option 5 and option 2 is fairly narrow. You'll see how that changes in the next slide when we look at the actual debt service because of the higher interest rates associated with the revenue bond financing, and then the gap between options 1 and 4, fairly close now, but grows before. And I think one way that I look at this is there's really 2 choices in front of you, or really there's 2 scenarios, and in both of those scenarios, awarding now is the best option. So if you were successful with a revolving fund loan, accepting the bid now is the best option, that 14.1 versus the 14,976. And then in the other scenarios where you're not successful in a state revolving fund loan, accepting the bid now is also the option that has the least amount of debt. Okay. So looking at annual debt service, this is a similar order, but the gaps have changed a little bit. And as I mentioned, the gap between option 5 and 2, this is the annual debt service associated with the debt that we showed you in the prior slide. So it goes from a low of just under $900,000 for a revolving fund loan, all the way up to almost $1.4 million for issuing full revenue bonds with a 10% cost increase in the fall of next year, third quarter of next year. Okay? And you can see the gap between option 5 and 2 grew, primarily compared to the amount of debt, and that's primarily due to the interest rate associated with the revenue bonds being much higher. That's the 3.26 versus the 2.4. And then you can see the gap between options 1 to 4 also grew, and again, it's a function of the interest rate associated with the revenue bond, full revenue bond in the fall of third quarter of next year. Okay? And then if you look at it on a net present value basis, and if you're not familiar with net present value analysis, it essentially just answers that question about what is the equivalent cost of these options in today's dollars. So it takes the cash flow over the next 20 years and brings it back to present dollars. So what does it really what's the difference in terms of the amount that we're asking you to, or what's the equivalent in terms of the cost in today's dollars of these different scenarios. And you can see the least cost options are, again, the two state revolving fund loan options. And again, the order and the gaps are very similar to the annual debt service slide that I showed you before. Okay?
What's the discount rate that you're assuming?
We're using the borrowing rate, the 3.26. So we use that, and that's why, you don't want to get into too much of it, but that's why the top option, 13 million, is below, the top two are below the amount of debt that you'd issue, because the present value of that is, you're paying 2.5%, but we're discounting those cash flows at 3.26. So it's a little bit more nuanced than I was prepared to get into, but that's essentially how those numbers got there. Okay. Looking at other factors, all scenarios except 6 and 7 have lower debt service than the FCS rate model assumptions. So we went back and we opened up the rate model and looked what the debt service was being assumed in that model at the 4.5%. So you're essentially getting yourself a better set of debt service costs than the FCS rate model assumed. We also looked at a couple of different break-even scenarios. If you were to reject the bids and you had to go to revenue bond financing in the third quarter of 2015, you'd really have to have 15% lower costs to have a net present value equivalent to the Public Works Trust Fund revenue bond option now. You'd have to have 5% lower costs would be comparable to an all revenue bond option. So if you weren't able to get either a revolving fund or a Public Works Trust Fund loan, you'd need a 5% lower cost in the rebid to be indifferent between those two options. Also looked at a third option. I haven't shared this with staff necessarily, but you'd have to have an interest rate of roughly 2.5% to offset the costs, a 5% cost increase. So it sort of frames, do you think costs are going to go up 5%? If you do, to be indifferent with going now with the revenue bond option, you'd have to have rates at 2.5%, which is much lower than what historically has happened and what we believe will happen in the future. Okay, so those are the different scenarios that we looked at in the break-even. We also thought about other ways to use the state loans. Could we essentially borrow the money and then use the state loans to pay off any of the revenue bond debt? We haven't been able to find a citation in the program requirements that would prohibit that, but they're very clear the state loans are to be used for construction projects. They do say that you can use those loans to repay costs. Typically that's in the form of either short-term financing, interfund loans, or use of cash from your operating or capital funds. That's a more typical scenario. And then, as Councilor Greenlee and I just talked about, long-term bonds with a large portion of the bonds callable in a very short term are typically not available in the marketplace and are not considered marketable. So again, to restate the recommendation, be to accept the bids, plan for a 4 to 5 million bond issue in 2014. This essentially preserves your ability to pursue options 1 to 3, assuming that you have other projects that you can use that money to fund. Use the 2011 bonds, cash, and some of the new bond funds to pay construction through the notice of the award from the state. We looked at the cash flow, and you'll be able to get, you'll need that 2014 bond issue if you're going into the second quarter of next year. And again, this effectively preserves the ability to go with option 1, 2, or 3 and hedges the risk of being denied the state revolving fund loan. Okay? And this just shows you in green those 3 options that you would be able to preserve by going forward. 3 of the 4 options, and effectively the top one trumps, 3 trumps number 5 if you're successful. And that's conclusion of the analysis. I believe an agenda bill is on your agenda tonight to award the bid. The next steps would be to plan for a bond issue before the end of the year to again take advantage of the bank qualified financing. Continue to pursue the Public Works Trust Fund and the State Revolving Fund loans. I know that you're already in for the trust fund. The State Revolving Fund, I think, is due sometime in the near term.
Yes.
Next month.
Yep.
And then you are proceeding with the general sewer plan update, and as a combination with that, I think staff is recommending that you update the rate review, have FCS look at the rates. But in the meantime, in 2015, there would be no increase in the sewer rates. I don't think you're contemplating one, and there isn't one required by this financing.
Right. But because the recommended options have debt service that's below what was in the rate model, we want to evaluate that moving forward to see if there's any opportunity to make changes. Because we're another mandate to have our general sewer plan updated, and that's on tap for next year. FCS has to be part of that project because you have to show that information to the state when you do that. It makes sense to not engage them twice to do that. Let's engage them as part of that process. And since we're floating at 0 anyway for 15 on sewer rates, it made sense to engage them and make sure that their scope fully contemplates whatever option we end up with here, what the numbers actually end up, and hopefully there'll be some good news that will result from that that could be deployed later next year for the years moving forward. So I think one punchline from all of this is the news is ultimately going to be better than what we've been assuming, unless some dramatic change happens to in the very short term to the revenue bond market. So we're not anticipating that, but until we authorize the bonds and get them, the rate's not locked in.
So this is pretty straightforward. If you were to try and make it complicated in any way, it would be thicker.
Yes, I think that moving forward now gives you the best opportunity to preserve the lowest cost. Finance people are conservative usually when looking at trying to take advantage of the low interest rates here. I think that's an advantage for you. And the bid environment, I think, just again poses additional risks if you were to delay.
So for council, it's really a question of which direction you would want to go or which direction you're comfortable with us going. I think without a doubt we're obviously in the middle of a whole lot of tweener scenarios. Our confidence level with Paul's research and the information that he's put together is extremely high. So it's a balancing act.
Our recommendation tonight on your regular meeting agenda, as you probably saw in your packet, is to accept the bid and to authorize the mayor to sign the contract with the low and responsive bidder. It's the contract that was in your packet for the last meeting, so you've had a chance to look at the contract. It's the same document as you had a couple weeks ago, and that we would then be back in the relatively short term, get moving quickly on pursuing the bankable revenue bond in that $3 to $4 million range.
4 to 5.
Or excuse me, 4 to 5. Thank you, Paul. In that 4 to 5 million range, continue to pursue the state financing, and then once we find out where we're at with that, we'll either be in for a second bankable revenue bond early in 15, or we'll leverage state funding at that lower rate. Keeps our options open, keeps the project moving. We hedge against construction cost risk, we hedge against interest rate risk, we hedge against state financing availability risk. And if you go back to the recommendation histogram there, this one, really the one that we're pointing to, although it does preserve 1 and 3 as well, we're really pointing to 2 as what we're shooting for, which is the third one down. And so to kind of put a face on it, what we are recommending is that we incur $158,000 of debt service above the most economical alternative, because it is more prudent than holding out and hoping that we get that top one, hedging risk against ending up with the bottom one. And so we think it's prudent, even though it'll cost a little bit more, because if we're unsuccessful with the top item there, we could find ourselves down at the bottom.
As I understand it, this project is being imposed on us, it's being mandated.
This is a mandate, right, for redundancy. Now, it's fair to say that in providing the redundancy, and Trevor, step in if necessary, in providing that redundancy, we gain some capacity in the plant for our growth plans, which are part of our 20-year plan. But even if we didn't have that growth plan and the need for that capacity, the redundancy is completely required. And so there's no not doing the project.
Are you going to have sufficient redundancy here that if you use part of that redundancy for growth, you've still got the redundancy that's required by the state?
Yes, that's built into the calculations and working with Brown and Caldwell, and basically doubling the size of the plant. It's a redundancy project, but really poises us towards doubling the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant. Right now it's 2.24 MGD, million gallons per day. Pushes us towards that 4.48 for being able to accommodate future growth.
So you could actually use part of that for growth and still meet the state requirements for redundancy?
Correct.
Okay.
How much growth do you think that, I mean, of course, we don't know how quickly we're gonna grow, but
Really,
what is your
doubles the
prediction?
system.
Yeah, depends on the next countywide update, GMA, and all the assumptions built in on growth projections. But we'll also be undertaking that within our GSP, our General Sewer Plan update by in late 2015.
The assumptions that are behind that for now, when you look at this map, the area outside of the yellow dotted line, but within the pink dotted line, so Norway and Woodburn primarily, that's our urban growth area. That's been our urban growth area for some time. There are assumptions about how land will develop there. Those assumptions are what are informing everything. Some of that is residential, much of it is employment center.
We don't have a date.
That's market, you know, it is there and available. It's not all served yet, but the ground is there. And, you know, we have some annexations coming up on the Woodburn side, so that's starting the process. I think, but the punchline of the question is, unfortunately, this is a mandate, and this is a burden on the community. We have to do it. It has advantage for us because it provides capacity enhancements, but we are not alone. Communities across the state are facing this type of an issue, and as we committed to you when we were looking at rates in 2010, and again in 12 and 13, we're doing everything we possibly can to mitigate the impacts of these costs to all of us as ratepayers. And the good news out of this analysis is that the interest rate market, whether it's revenue bonds or state financing, are coming in better than the assumptions that we used in the rate model, because necessarily in the rate model we were conservative. We were a couple years ago and we were looking at what the rates were, and we had to make assumptions about what they would be in 2014. So 2 years ago we were assuming 4.5% in this market, and non-bankable bonds, because the amount was in the 14 million range. This strategy, honed, a little better honed, is helping. So we think that there'll be some opportunities, but before we really know what that is, we need to do this general sewer plan update next year, just to be sure.
Well,
Where are we at on capacity on the existing plant?
Right about 78%.
So, just roughly speaking, 22% of the, if you have just a matching redundancy, you now can increase your load 22% because you could handle that in the redundant situation, but other than that, you can use the other plant to peak level.
Right, depending on the constituents and the inflow, as far as industrial part compared to domestic flow. There's quite a bit of calculations to take into consideration as far as load, suspended solids, BOD, oxygen demand, so it tends to get fairly complex, but general sense, order of magnitude, yes. and that's off of peak flow demand, typically wet season, infiltration and inflow, basically fancy for rainwater getting into the sanitary sewer system for treating stormwater runoff.
And then the other thing, I really appreciate the financial analysis here. It really looks to me like everything was turned over and looked at. I'm not interested in holding out for 5. There's an old saying on Wall Street, bears make money, bulls make money, pigs get slaughtered. And it strikes me that number 5 is piggish.
Jennifer?
Yep, I have a question about the debt service. I took a look at the budget, and I think we budgeted around $900,000 in revenue, correct, for 2014?
For the sewer utility, I don't think that that's,
In rate revenue,
or debt service?
Something, it says other financing sources under revenues,
Oh.
$900,000.
Oh, you're,
$700,000 in 2013.
is that the bond fund? I'm not sure what you're looking at, but I think your current revenue bond debt service is roughly that number.
Okay.
where are you at specifically in the budget? I have the
Oh,
budget open.
I'm on page, where is it? Page 77.
Do our best without Jen in the room to answer the question.
I did look at those numbers though, so.
That is our
I'm just
bond
trying to make
fund.
sure that, you know, what we're bringing in is enough to cover number 2.
Yes. Right, so this is Fund 413, it's our bond fund. It lists all the projects that we projected might happen in 2014, and it shows the new bond. It shows us grabbing $10.2 million of revenue bond as a revenue source, all of those expenditures. And then, yes, about $900,000 in bond payments because we were anticipating a higher rate. So when you look at our scenario, you know, we're proposing that we would be serving about $1 million. That would be moving forward in 2015. And our rate model accommodates that. There's a small increase in water rates that happen in 2015. There's no increase in sewer rates.
Part of the answer is we talked about the cash reserves that you've built up over the last couple of years that you can transfer to the construction fund. Well, part of that is making sure you don't have to have your rates step up, but you put it on a slope. I'm sure FCS talked about, you know, gradual increases. Well, that capacity, that $1.7 million, $2 million that you have for capital projects now is 2 years worth. And so that money, instead of going for capital projects, once this debt's issued, it'll go to pay debt service as opposed to sitting in reserves and being available for future capital projects. There's still some money in the rate model set aside for funding of future capital projects, but essentially that's where that cash, instead of going to pay for capital projects, it'll go to pay for the projects you funded with debt.
That's an excellent question, and we are prepared to meet the debt service. Yep. In fact, better prepared than
Yes.
we would have otherwise been.
How soon can do you plan on bringing an authorization for bank qualified bonds to council?
We'd have to get with Jim to find out how quickly we can do that, but I think it would be prudent to move as quickly as possible.
That's my thought also, but I think we're looking at probably a couple of months rather than weeks.
I would think there's some work to do. They always want to rate you again. So it's an exercise.
He's motivated, so, and plus, the other thing that we haven't mentioned is that there is a potential for some other financing that he's, been talking about as well. So I think he's had some things moving in his head, so I don't know how much he could get further along, but it won't be a new idea for him.
Could we do it by the end of October? I'm not sure. Potentially early November. We do meet 3 times in November. And just so it's not a surprise the next time we talk about this, what Paul was alluding to. Jim has floated the notion to us at the staff level about the possibility of some, and I don't know if I get the lingo right. I always use refi because I understand that for my own, mortgage. I don't know if that's the exact terminology to use with some of the existing debt that we have, but he sees some potential there. It would have nothing to do with the wastewater treatment plant and everything to do with some existing debt that we have that's market rate whenever it was issued. There's the potential for some reduction in our total debt service load that we already have. But, just like if you were looking at your own mortgage, you have to weigh the pros and cons of reissuing. And so we'll probably have him take a run at that for us, and so we can talk to the council about whether that makes sense or not.
The only thing I have to say is sooner rather than later.
Yeah. We initiated these conversations. He was at the my state association meeting, and I made a point to sit next to him at one of the meals so that we could talk about our project.
Jennifer?
Yeah, so how does this affect our overall debt capacity and rating?
In terms of the debt capacity, this is a revenue bond, so the what's backing this is the revenue from the utility, so it doesn't count against your non-voted debt capacity or your voted debt capacity. So it's
That was the rate plan that we put in place and committed to for.
correct.
Right.
So it
Right.
doesn't take any of your general debt capacity. I don't know enough about how it affects your rating. My guess is you've got the rate. You've got the rate increases you've committed to. My guess is there wouldn't be much of an impact at all, especially since the revenue's already in place to make this issue. It's contemplated. It was probably part of the packet that they reviewed for the 2011 bond issue, be my guess. I don't know, but I wouldn't think it would be an issue. So.
Right. The short answer is it doesn't affect our geo limits at all. They're revenue bonds, and typically that's why revenue bonds are the financing mechanism of choice, short of the preferred financing from state loans, which also do not count against your geo. I mean, we could use general obligation bonds in our general fund to pay for utilities, but that's unwise because of those implications.
Other questions?
Great. I just want to take the opportunity to thank the folks that helped on this, Rob, Charles, Trevor, Jennifer, Jim, and David. I mean, it was a team effort, so there's a lot of pieces coming from a bunch of different places, so appreciate all their assistance and appreciate the chance to be in front of you again.
Well, thank you for boiling this thing down.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, Trevor, interagency agreement from Department of Enterprise Services.
Yes, we've been working with DES dating back to March, April of this year, 2014. We took the first step. Council authorized the mayor to sign the interagency agreement with DES to start the process of the AMI project, the Automated Metering Infrastructure Project, working in partnership with McKinstry Ascension. We've worked back and forth on multiple iterations of the proposed investment grade audit that McKinstry has proposed to provide or render services for us, looking at the automated metering project. It has received approval from DES in working with their staff contact, Mr. Bollinger. He recommended coming back to council and giving a quick update. The changes since we touched base last, the original agreement was performance-based. Basically, McKinstry, the $18,850 for the services of conducting an investment-grade audit was performance-based. They were not to be reimbursed until the grant was awarded from Department of Commerce through DES. Enterprise Services staff members recommended coming back and recommending as well that for the services rendered to move forward towards the grant deadline date to update the interagency agreement and engage in a contract with Enterprise Services. So you'll see there's a description as far as the scope of work or the scope of services. We have had McKinstry Ascension on site. They've done the field verification with staff at water meters physically. Looked at some of the hotspot areas as far as areas where we have some topo issues, some topographical issues, as you would assume, especially with the north part of town. They've also done some measurement as far as looking at the return on investment, the ROI for this specific project. Our general sense order of magnitude is right around 8 to 9 years based on the investment for the full project for design and construction. And they're also putting together, as part of this proposed investment grade audit, the IGA, a GMAX, which is a guaranteed maximum construction costs. And you'll see further down in the proposed IGA, the timeline and milestones. Those will need to be updated. Again, this is just for workshopping tonight. This would be coming back to you in the first meeting in October with an updated timeline and milestones, as well as some other pertinent information as we tighten up and look forward to submitting for the grant cycle for the automated metering infrastructure project.
Questions? David?
You referred to topo issues up on the northern part of town. What kind of topographic issues are you having?
We have the ability with infrastructure to be able to put I guess the collectors and repeaters for sending signals back to City Hall for the automated meter reading. We're able to utilize reservoirs and have assets in specific locations where it's not a hindrance. So we're able to use the reservoir site specifically up on Mount Norway, right at Lear Road. And I believe it's easier to point to it, I believe. I have a general reference. Most of you, when you drive by a 100-foot tower, you recognize what it is. So right up here on top of 32nd at Lear and
I live 150 feet from it.
Yep. And then also this little white dot here is Woodburn Hill Reservoir that feeds everything on the west side of town, all the way to Crown Road. So we're able to put a structure on top of that as well. So it's not quite as problematic as it is for other utilities, since we have that infrastructure in place.
Okay.
Might we use that infrastructure and lease some of its capacity to Clark and Northwest Natural?
So you'll see in the draft scope of services, correspondence and collaboration with not only Northwest Natural, but Clark Public Utilities. Right now, my understanding, CPU utilizes a mobile network.
Yep.
So at least for this portion of Clark County, East Clark County, they're able to drive streets in specific areas to gather meter readings for natural gas, or excuse me, for CPU, for power, electrical utility. Northwest Natural Gas has a keen interest in this specific project to be able to piggyback, and the opportunity for us to push information and enter into a franchise agreement, having the information at our fingertips. So that's fully vetted as well inside of the scope of services, the proposed scope of services by McKinstry Ascension.
Thank you.
The repeaters you're using are FM radios, line of sight?
I'd have to look at what's being proposed. That's part of actually doing the feasibility of it. A lot of it is actually either cell backup with FM. There's redundancy that's built in, but again, they work through the diagnostic, if you will, in looking at our topo and the type of power availability or battery operated, and then typically there's a redundancy that's built in. So if you do lose power or radio or whatever the frequency might be, you have that built in to still be able to collect the readings.
Would you have to construct a tower on this level, or could you use the police tower?
We'd be able to, via our franchise agreement with Clark Public Utilities, to use power poles that are within the public right-of-way or close to public right-of-way. So we've also looked at that as well along East Street, where they have the main transmission main that comes from East County. So they're amenable to that. We've had those conversations with them at an entry level.
Thank you.
Other questions?
So the ask of enterprise services via Commerce is a 25% match for the project based on energy efficiency improvements. So that equates to right around $340,000 to $345,000 to support the project and take additional pressure off of utility funds.
So this is coming out of the enterprise fund?
Yes.
So that's the award that we're asking for,
Yes.
several $100,000.
Yeah,
if
25% match for the project based on energy efficiency improvements, and then the measurement and verification. We start getting into the details of not rolling vehicles, utility trucks out. We're doing rereads and human assets for the labor and overhead to go out and read meters or follow up on rereads, and then we've also got water loss savings as well. We're able to identify real time with a fixed network. We can see leaks real time on a half-hour or hour basis instead of visiting the meter every 60 days. Because right now we bill monthly but we read monthly but bill bi-monthly. So we only physically visit a meter every 60 days. And so there's significant savings on leak detection as well, not only for ourselves but for customers.
Question?
Is this in the form of like wires? What does this look like?
It's wireless just about like anything anymore.
Okay.
And then you'll have basically a power system or a separate platform that we're able to integrate with our utility billing software, our HTE SunGuard, to be able to basically dovetail that in, to be able to have the meter reads come right into our utility billing specialist to the utility department. So I'm really down or discounting the complexity of being able to integrate those systems. But it is, and again, before jumping into a full-blown integration, we did do the pilot downtown. So it's about 120 meters. That includes the Pendleton Woolen Mill meter. So we just want to get a general sense and putting in 120 Hertz, which is the sensor inside the meter box, as well as a collector and repeater downtown to make sure that was fully functional for us. So that's been up and operational for I think about 9 to 10 months.
You said there's a 25% match for this? So we have to come up with 25% and they pay 75%?
Department of Commerce would come up with 25%.
We come up with 75%?
The utility, the enterprise would
Okay.
come up with the 75%.
When you said 25% match, that sounded awfully good.
Yeah,
I know.
sorry, I
They're matching,
misquoted
not
that.
us.
They'll reimburse us because of the energy efficiency.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know they love that.
Yeah, and at the next meeting, the ask of the council is to authorize the mayor to enter into this arrangement, and that's $18,000 through the Department of Commerce.
And they'll procure through the Department of Commerce as far as audit implications and everything else. We've fully vetted that with the finance director and the accountant. So had good experiences with Commerce and DES on previous projects.
Good, Joe.
So if I tracked with you, we send someone out once a month.
Yeah.
And with this new program, you only go out every 6 months?
We go out only if we have a problem at the meter box as far as the sensor.
Okay, so my question is, how does that affect our employees that do this job normally that go?
Excellent
door to door?
question. So the intent with this specific initiative or feasibility in looking at fixed network was to be able to redeploy human assets. So the ability to do water quality flushing on dead ends, valve exercising, taking care of tank exteriors, rebuilding pumps, all those different things that we get to, the best we can given the time available, but we'd be able to be much more robust in maintaining infrastructure, being preventative instead of emergency or maintenance and repair in maintaining infrastructure.
So you won't lose any personnel?
No, it's a redeployment focusing
Give them
on
different jobs,
operation and maintenance.
maintenance.
You might recall a couple of years ago, we were doing some feasibility analysis, and the consultant that we work with came back and talked to us about how we were gonna need more human resources over time as our utility system was growing, and some unmet things that were, that we would need to pay attention to that we weren't paying attention to or are not as much as we should. And at that time, we committed to do everything we can to mitigate the growth in system costs that would be associated with having to have more human resources to do those things. This is one such project where automation enables us to not have to grow the team per se, but we can redeploy instead. And it's a one-time cost with some ongoing maintenance, but not, it's more efficient than, growing the staff level.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Trevor? Okay,
Thanks.
on to budget items. Dave, do you want to start taking these at this point?
Yes, we have, there's 3 items on the agenda. Item B, which is the Finance and Police Department highlights. We've been doing the highlights over the last several meetings. That one is, should fit within the time that we have. Item C, which is the statutorily required full presentation of preliminary revenue and expenditure estimates for the 2015 budget. This might feel a little early to you. It's due October 6th by statute, but we don't have a meeting between now and October 13, so it's pushed up a little bit from previous years. We thought this might need to carry over into the regular meeting, and so that would be what we would anticipate happening tonight.
Okay. Jen, you ready? Good evening, Chief.
While they're coming up, I just wanted to tell Trevor, thanks very much for all the work he and his guys have done.
You're not hearing you.
I'll catch him later.
When do I get to talk to Trevor? When you told me about
Hey, good evening.
Good evening.
This follows the trend of the other department highlights that we've done already. So we're going to go through the police budgets tonight, and then we'll do the finance IT after this one. We're going to compare, as with the other departments, the 15 budget to the 14, proposed 15 budget to the 14 budget. So the highlights for the police department, they have 4 funds that Chief Mitchell manages: the Police and Code Enforcement Department, the Animal Control Department, the Court Department, and then the Drug Fund is a separate fund. So we broke it out into those areas. I'm going to go through kind of the high level in various slides here, and then I'm not going to really explain the differences because that relates to the highlights that Chief is going to talk about. So I'm just going to stay high level here and show the differences. The number in parentheses is the 14 budget, and then the other one is the 15. So you can see police and code enforcement is estimated at 3.2 for 15 compared to roughly 3 million in 14. Most of the difference is in salary benefits, and we are budgeting as if the levy will pass. So this includes the expense of a new officer. Again, we'll change that should that not occur, but we're we're budgeting to be positive. And then the operations and maintenance, and then some intergovernmental services. In the animal control budget, we're proposing a slight decrease, and again, that's one of the highlights, so I'll leave you in suspense for a few moments. Again, we broke it out between salary and benefits, the operations and maintenance, and then professional services is the per dog charge that we pay to West Columbia. Mm-hmm. We don't spend that much, but we're basing it kind of on an annual high number of dogs. So we're proposing to keep it at that same amount, even though we're not at that level for 14.
What is the actuals on those? Just
on the dogs?
to know more of an average.
It's what, roughly 10 a month?
Year to date for West Columbia is, where do they have that? I think it's only like about $6,000 or $7,000.
Yeah, it's not.
Year to date is pretty low. Last month, I think, was one of the higher invoices that we've had. It was a couple of thousand, but it runs maybe $500 to $700 a month.
The judicial or court budget, again, we don't have staff in this area. It's all contracted through with either professional services or intergovernmental agreements with the City of Camas and Clark County. Expecting a slight increase in that department. So always hope for the best. And then the drug fund are funds that we get either through different, I guess, I don't know, drug operations that Ranger goes to with Officer Day. And we get a certain percentage of those federal dollars back, depending on how much is seized at the time. And we also get a monthly drug allocation from Clark County, I think, depending upon our caseload there as well. So those need to be used to support or enhance the drug awareness programs, and so that's what we've been using those funds for. We've also received some sizable donations from some community members in the past, and they continue to donate to the program. So it's been very helpful for additional training opportunities.
Who's donating to it?
Kathy Markham has continued her donation even after the initial donation for the new dog. She's continued to do numerous things for the canine program.
That's her heart.
Very nice of her. So that leads us to the highlights. We'll start with police and code enforcement, and then we'll go to the other funds.
So as Jen mentioned, we're trying to be positive, and we're assuming that the levy will pass. So that would include the addition of one extra officer. It has to pass. I've already submitted their name to the academy to get them in. So, no, along with that.
So does that have a full year of salary or just a partial year of salary?
It is
It'd be
a full year.
My understanding, that would be take effect Jan 1. So, along with that, there would be some remaining revenue from that, and that would go maybe into a professional services line item until we decide how best we want to use that, whether it's code enforcement or some other police-related pieces. You'll see also on there the Cressa radio replacement fund. That's kind of a big deal going on, that Cressa has been updating their radio and their infrastructure system. They just signed the contract with Motorola. Right now, they're kind of sorting out just exactly what all the expenses are going to be. We know that, or at least I'm told, that this is primarily going to hit us in 2016. But, so we're looking at maybe putting, I think, what, $25,000 into a fund just as a placeholder to get us ready for the 2016 budget.
How much will that cost?
The last figures that were given to me for Washoe was $130,000. Now, there's going to be a new set of figures coming out. That was at the time when they were bidding with Harris, and there's been some other changes, so I hope to have a better set of numbers coming soon. But that's what it was last time I saw it.
We're hopeful that Cressa in the lead will be able to find us some grant money for some of this. In the fire services, they've been very successful at getting grant support for radio replacements. Just now kind of starting to dabble through Cressa into this, that domain for public safety, law enforcement. And they're going to do everything they can on our behalf to mitigate that cost, but we are going to have these new radios because they're going to be moving off of the analog system, the overall system. We would look at not having a lump sum. Some of our colleagues, and we in our planning, are looking at very low-cost financing so that we could mitigate the hit to the general fund in a one-time. And again, as Chief mentioned, it's probably 2016 in the budget this year. There'll just be a little placeholder just in case it starts to roll out later in 15. That's the problem with some of these projects. You know, these projects transcend calendar years and budget development cycles, and so you take the best information you have at the time so that you can craft your budget. But there's a lot of unanswered questions still on this radio replacement project.
What does CRESA stand for, CRESA?
Clark Regional Emergency Services.
Agency.
Yes.
Clark Regional Emergency Services Agency. Right?
Are you using FM or AM radios?
These are 800,
They're what?
800 megahertz radios. And then they're going to go to, the ones they're going to, I think, is, they operate off of the, like the internet.
My understanding is it's packet-based. So it's not technically AM or FM, it's packet.
Okay. Very
So
few
what's
of
a
us know
packet?
what packets are, but I happen to know that one.
Data pulse.
Okay. I can't think there's anything else on the CRESA piece, but there'll be more information that'll be coming up shortly on that. And I know Motorola is interested in trying to work with CRESA. And like David was saying, for some reason, there seems to be these grants out there for fire departments, but there's not as many for police. So they are all committed to kind of working with all of us to see what we can do.
Right. It could even be vendor financed at a very favorable rate, and that might be. But when the time comes, we'll present the options similar to what we just did earlier today. A much lower dollar amount, but still the options analysis will be important.
And you're saying 2016 is the
That's
start date?
Most likely.
most likely. There was some, Motorola, I think, wanted to do the radios first and then build the infrastructure last, but most cities don't really have the funds to do all this right now, so they're saying, no, let's go ahead and do the infrastructure first and purchase the radios, which will give cities some time to kind of organize and plan and see what we can do to cover those expenses.
If it's packet-based, your transmissions will be basically encrypted, right?
That I don't know. I don't know. They're not encrypted to the sense that they were when they used, I think it was called VPN or something like that, where it scrambled it.
VPA.
Now I believe that it uses like a rolling number. You can still scan our frequencies, but it's not like a set frequency. So once you have it dialed in, it changes.
Okay.
Okay, the other thing we have highlighted is establish an abatement budget, and I think we had looked at maybe $50,000 going into that fund to deal with abatement issues. After going through this recent one, we realized that it's pretty expensive, and I know for just attorney fees and that sort of thing, and then the final, the actual demo was probably close to that by the time we, maybe under that.
The demo was just under 12,000, but then we had to do an asbestos permit and various other expenses, and then the attorney fees for the court process were pretty extensive along the way. So we do get to lien the property with those costs, but we still have to pay them up front to get the work done.
This is something we've been wanting to do. There wasn't the pressure to do it because we didn't have the egregious case last budget cycle or the budget cycle before that. But a best practice in the area of code enforcement and nuisance and dangerous building abatement is to have a fund set aside so that you are ready to take action when you need to take action. We're essentially leveraging anticipated operating savings, and we abated this dangerous building this year after an arduous and lengthy due process, which is important when you're going to abate someone's property, the nuisance on someone's property. But eventually, we have a very high lien position. You can recover costs, including staff costs, finance costs. There's a lot of costs that are recoverable, and the idea is that it's a fund that replenishes itself over time, but you have to initially set it up. Jennifer is still working through exactly the best mechanics of that in our budget, whether it's a line item in the police budget or a separate department altogether, or whether it's even a fund. Because we want to seed it one time and then not necessarily not spend it and then have to ask you to do that every year to seed this fund. And just so that you know, we anticipate using our unrestricted reserves to seed this fund initially. Those details will be presented when we have the detailed budget ready to go. It's about $50,000.
How is it replenished?
When the properties change hands or are foreclosed upon, we have a senior lien position, and so we will lien this property and any other properties that we abate, and then we recover that through the lien. It's the last straw scenario in trying to gain compliance with our nuisance codes, and there, unfortunately, from time to time, there'll be a situation where we have to, of our own initiative, go and actually get a court order and go on to private property and abate a nuisance. Very difficult process, difficult thing to do. We've had to do that once this year. And that just kind of put this on the front burner for us, that we ought to adopt this best practice and have an abatement fund in place.
Have we ever had to do that before?
I am not aware of
I'm
that.
not aware of it, this is the
Rose
first
is
time.
shaking her head.
Yes, in 1998, 99, we did do that. The house by Gateway that had been burned up, and we weren't able to contact the owners, and we had to.
So it's been a while. You've been here for, do you remember it before that? Do you remember anything before that? No. So maybe only twice in recent memory.
Joyce?
I was by the property today, and I'm sure the neighbors are very happy.
It is amazing.
It is incredible.
Okay.
So Chief, I'm gonna have you and Jennifer back up a little bit, especially for Michelle's benefit. If we could go back to your police code enforcement and just go through, obviously, the salaries and benefits are salaries and benefits. But if you could just pop in some examples of what fall under by all four of the funds, the operations and maintenance, and then what we have coming your direction for intergovernmental services and what falls inside there.
Operations and maintenance, my assumption on that would be for the building.
Pretty much everything that's not a service contract. So the intergovernmental services would be with CRESA for the 911 services. Right here, so I'd have the line items.
Court doesn't go into that.
No, court doesn't go on that. It's essentially CRESA costs and other communication costs. Professional service line items, code enforcement, bulletproof vests, ammunition, uniforms, operating supplies, utilities on the building, are the operations and maintenance portion.
Vehicles, fuel.
Mm-hmm.
Dog food,
That's right.
No, that's a
That's out of
K-9.
K-9, out of the
No.
drug fund, we'll get there.
drug fund.
Drug fund. Good?
Questions on the police side of the house?
Now we'll go to the other one.
Okay.
I lumped the other three together.
Okay, so now you got animal control, the judicial, and drug fund. We are expecting just a slight decrease in the animal control budget just due to we purchased some software for the computers that was a one-time purchase. And that, and I think if things kind of hold out, probably a decrease in the professional services through a reduced amount of impounds. We're also assuming that there's going to be a slight increase in court costs. I don't think it's going to be too much. I know we, work with the county and with Camus to kind of help keep those costs down and see what we can do on that. But probably just be a slight bump on that. And then the increase in the training and the drug fund. With having a dual-purpose dog now, we actually spend more time training. When it was just a narcotic dog, we trained a little bit less, but now that he's an actual patrol dog, we spend more time in training for that. And just to let you know too, he did participate in a event about 2 weeks ago where they found goods on the drugs, on a vehicle that's coming up from California. And so we'll get a piece of that pie as well. So that goes back into the drug fund. It takes a bit of time to see those, but eventually they just roll in.
Question on animal control?
Yes.
I know you put some towards the feral cats.
Oh,
Does that fall under
Thank
that?
you for bringing that up. I've been working with Misha, who is the board president, and asked her to kind of give me a spreadsheet or some information on what they've done so far. And I have that information. I just want to double check that with her when I meet with her Thursday. But according to the figures that she sent me, they spayed and neutered about 70 animals, and they've spent just under $5,000 in doing so. I think it was $49.70 or something along those lines.
And that, it's just for spaying them, or is that for
No, that's just spaying and
capturing
neuter.
them? It's just, ooh.
Yeah, they have a discounted rate. I think it's like maybe $40 or something like that for the spay and neuter. So, and then they had a couple of. Sometimes when they bring the animals in, they trap them. They're diseased or so sick they have to put them down. So there's, I think, maybe a couple of euthanasias in there. But it came in just under the 5,000. I just want to verify with her when I see her that these are all this year's figures and they're all washable animals.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's it.
Where we at?
All right, thank you.
Done? Any other questions?
Mathematically, did you say it was 70 animals?
Well, let me give you the exact here. It, yes, ironically, they've spayed 35 animals and they've neutered 35. They euthanized 5. It's a little bit more expensive. They pay $75 per cost for the females, $60 for a male. So for the total of, they've spent $2,625 for spaying cats, $2,100 to neuter, and then they spent $245 to euthanize 5 cats. So that cost them $49 per animal.
Why are you even bothering with the males? Because you're not gonna be able to neuter all the males, and therefore you'll always have males to mate with the females, and the females are the ones that produce the litters.
Well,
I know it's
Because you
cheaper,
never-
but.
You never get all the females either.
Yeah, that's just it.
No, but every one you get reduces a litter, whereas on the males, there's no guarantee.
Multiple litters.
Multiple letters.
Thank you, you just made my point.
But it will make a difference over a period of
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
It will definitely. This many, in fact, I'm surprised to hear that there were that many cats,
There's a
because that will make a
Terrible
difference.
practical problem with how you selectively trap males or females,
Yeah.
cats.
So I'll try and get some more information to understand this better, but this is what I was given thus far. And like I say, I just had a few questions for her. In fact, we both knew it this Thursday afternoon.
Thanks, Chief.
Thank you.
That's good, thanks.
Are we gonna do finance, or are we gonna wrap up?
You got 2 minutes.
Woohoo. You're that fast.
I'm 5 slides.
1,
There's 1, here's 2.
2.
We're talking about finance and information technology highlights. As you can see, the total budget for the finance information technology went up between years. And that's because our big highlight is that we pulled some of the expenses out of the general government section and put them under IT so that Theo can manage them better and track them. So the phone costs, the Comcast costs, the internet, the maintenance on SunGuard, and all those things that were in the general government fund have been pulled over here. So that one has gone down, and then our budget went up. So nothing fancy. It just is moving expenses from one line item to another, which was our #1 highlight. Other than that, finance and IT is status quo.
Any questions on status quo?
Wow. Amazing.
Okay, with that, we're at 6:30. We're going to adjourn this meeting, and we will be back here at 7 o'clock for our regular meeting.